In our last lecture, we explored the first part of Churchill's political life. We saw him enter Parliament at the age of 26 in 1900. Queen Victoria was still alive. And we saw him rise very rapidly, in part due to his change of parties, switching from the Conservative Party to the Liberal Party in 1904, and then moving rapidly through a series of government posts, remembering always that in the British system, to be in the cabinet, you must also be a member of Parliament. So he is both a member of Parliament as well as serving in the Liberal government. We saw him as Undersecretary for the Colonies, playing an important role in the settlement of South Africa, as President of the Board of Trade, essentially Secretary of Commerce, then as Home Secretary, and then at the very early age of 37, becoming First Lord of the Admiralty, the civilian in charge of the British Navy. And at that period, when the British Navy was all crucial and all powerful, to be First Lord of the Admiralty was perhaps second only to the Prime Minister in importance. And that importance grew with the coming of the Great War in 1914. And we took Churchill through the disastrous campaign at the Dardanelles in 1915, which would force him to resign from the government on May the 15th, 1915. Now, the Dardanelles was a seminal event in Churchill's political life. Indeed, in his life as a whole. He would never fully get over the disaster that was the Dardanelles. Years later, with all the success behind him, after leading Britain to victory in the Second World War, he would write that he had ruined himself for a period as a result of trying to undertake a great enterprise from a position of subordinate authority. His wife, Clementine, said, "I thought Winston would die of grief over the Dardanelles. I thought he would never get over it." It has been used as a test case by historians who do not share my admiration for Churchill. A book, for example, Winston Churchill, 1900 to 1939, A Study in Failure, looks upon the Dardanelles as typical of why Churchill was ultimately a failure. And I think we too should look at the Dardanelles, explore it in some depth. We start from the point of view of Churchill as a minister. We ask the question why he inspired such distrust among very important colleagues. One of his colleagues in the Admiralty said, "Churchill is a greater danger than the Germans by far." Another said, "I would much rather have Winston on the other side than with us." Why? Why this dislike that would play a crucial role in his fall? He did not stay in a box. I want to begin all of this by saying Churchill was a genius. He was a political genius, a genius as a statesman, in the same way that Julius Caesar was. And genius invokes distrust. One of Churchill's friends said that much of the envy and malice against Churchill came from the distrust with which mediocrity views genius at close quarters. Very few geniuses get to the top in the political world. I've tried several times to think of geniuses in our own political world. I have not come up with one yet. In the corporate world, no doubt, in the world of law and medicine, genius always rises to the top. Certainly not in the academic world. The only two geniuses I know of who were teachers were Socrates and Jesus. And both came to a very bad end. Socrates says, "It is envy that has brought me here." And Pilate recognized that it was out of envy that Jesus was delivered up to him. An old professor of mine said that in the academic world, A people will sometimes vote for A people, C people will sometimes vote for A people, but B people, mediocrities, always vote for C people. And so it is in the world of politics in which Winston Churchill lived. I mean, after all, he's suspicious. He writes books, lots of books, and they sell very, very well. He is a powerful, spellbinding speaker in Parliament. Those are worrisome things in their own. But he doesn't stay in his box. And as First Lord of the Admiralty, in the view of his colleagues and in the view of the Navy, the real sailors, his job was to fight to get them the largest budget possible, and that was that. But Churchill didn't see it that way. And already in 1911, he was working to transform the Navy. He worked to get bigger guns, replacing 13.5-inch guns by 15-inch guns. Well, all good and true, but he shouldn't be doing it. Let us, the sailors, be doing it, don't you see? It's not for him to tell us. If we still want 13.5 guns, let's have them. And then building faster warships. And along with that, to make these faster warships work, switching over from coal to oil. These were all very important innovations. He saw to it that they happened. But the sailors didn't like it. The admirals didn't like it. That's who I mean by the sailors. And then he took advice from bad sources in their view. Come to me, I'm the acting admiral in charge. I'm the first Sea Lord. No, he relied upon a retired admiral, John Fisher. Sir John Fisher had a reputation for being kind of strange himself, and in retirement he had grown even stranger. But he was Winston Churchill's main source of advice on these changes. And people would say with considerable justification, Winston is not a good picker. He doesn't choose good people to support him. He's quirky in who he chooses. And then the war breaks out. Churchill is very interested in flying, and he develops a Royal Naval Flying Corps. Well, that again is something out of the box. The admirals, like the generals, were convinced that aircraft was only for sport. It would never play a role in warfare. And then, there was that tragic business at Antwerp, that foolish business at Antwerp. See, by October 1914, the Germans had been unable to break through and capture Paris. But their mighty war machine was still on the march, and they were determined to capture all of the ports that dominate the English Channel, right down to Calais. Because, you see, if they had those ports, the British could not ship over, would have enormous difficulty in shipping troops and supplies to France. And they were moving upon Antwerp. And the Belgian army was barely holding on. They were shattered by the ceaseless German bombardments, German captures of their forts that were regarded as being invincible. And Churchill decided that Antwerp must be held. Well, that wasn't his decision as First Lord of the Admiralty. That was for the Army. But not only did he decide it must be held, he shipped troops. He shipped Royal Marines, over which he certainly had technical command, and then 2 units of recently recruited naval reserves, they were called. One of these naval reserves that went over was Rupert Brooke, the great poet, who would die in the Dardanelles campaign. The other was the son of the Prime Minister. And they went over to Antwerp, and Churchill went with them. And for 7 days led the defense of Antwerp, rushing around. Once someone described him as like a hero in a melodrama, rushing up on his horse to save the day. And he moved in the trenches. He held the Belgians on until finally, after 7 days, they did collapse. And the troops had to be withdrawn. This, in the newspaper, became the subject of ridicule. What is the First Lord of the Admiralty over there fighting a battle? And why did we send those troops over there at all? They had to be withdrawn. It was a fiasco. Such was also the view in the cabinet itself. Churchill was severely reprimanded for this overenthusiasm. Later on, the King of the Belgians in 1918 said that he thought no action more secured victory than Antwerp. He could never understand why the British made it a subject of ridicule. By holding on, it enabled enough British troops to land at Calais and other ports so that they were never captured. But the idea that it was a fiasco stuck to Churchill. And This is another aspect of Churchill's character. It is difficult to explain, but things stuck to him. Blame and years of explanation, official reports, would never remove these claims that hung to him, that tainted him. Antwerp would remain in the mind of the press and the public and most of his fellow cabinet members as a fiasco. There were other qualities that Churchill had that made him, in the eyes of his fellow cabinet members, not trustworthy. First, there was the legacy of his father. Churchill gloried in the legacy of Lord Randolph, and the astute young politician would have distanced himself from his father. Not Churchill. He wrote a biography of his father in which he heaped abuse upon those who had abused his father. Now, his father had the reputation of being untrustworthy, of being a political adventurer, of always scheming, and this too rubbed off on Winston. And then, yes, he was a powerful speaker. He could also be very sarcastic. The right honorable gentleman is one of those speakers who, before he gets up, does not know what he is going to say, while he is speaking, does not know what he is saying, and when he is finished, does not know what he has said. Now, this just does not win you friends. Now, Churchill thought it was wonderful that Parliament had this tradition of give and take. Well, maybe it did, but it also had people with very long memories. And Churchill also did not have antennae. Remember in our first lecture I said he had a moral compass. We have antennae. A political career depends upon antennae. Churchill could never read people, what they were really thinking about him. And so, because he went to their dinner parties, because he stayed at their country homes, he thought these people were his friends. They weren't. And he was a threat. And see, there he didn't understand politics. Politics is a very bloody business. To stay on top, you must recognize who's the greatest threat to your job and figure a way to get rid of them. The war, too, was different than anyone had ever seen. I mean, wars are places where generals and admirals win reputations. That's what they live for. And yet this was a war like none that had ever been before. Carnage on a vast scale, enormous fronts, and no way to bring it to an end. And guiding Britain's strategy during this period was the great figure of Horatio Kitchener, Lord Kitchener, Kitchener of Khartoum, with his great swirling mustaches, huge beefy figure. He looked out at you from recruiting posters all over Britain, all over the empire. I want you. He was building a new army. He was so powerful and so much a myth in the public mind that he could not be contradicted. And whatever he said went. Kitchener had a long memory. He had never liked Churchill. He had not liked Churchill being sent out to him during the expedition that ended in the Battle of Omdurman. As Churchill said, it was a case of dislike before first sight. And he had never liked Churchill after that. He was friendly with him, seemed sympathetic, but he, like others in the cabinet, were setting Churchill up for failure. And if the lives of 213,000 men depended upon this, well, so be it. Such is the cost of war. So the Dardanelles campaign was indeed the brainchild of Churchill. It was a desire to break with the slaughter on the Western Front and to carry out this bold, sweeping movement, as we saw in our last lecture. We remember we were going to force the Dardanelles, knock out the Turkish forts, capture Constantinople, and then, well, turn in a great sweeping flank action, move up through the Balkans, capture Vienna, knocking Austria out of the war, and then turn upon Germany. Well, Kitchener and most of the high command just didn't like this idea to start with. They knew how the war would be won. It would be won by killing Germans in France. It is just that simple. and they didn't want someone like Churchill telling them otherwise. Their careers and reputations were based upon this. But if he were determined to do it, go ahead. And the cabinet agrees, Kitchener agrees, the admiral on the spot agrees. But the strategy was always flawed. First of all, it was put together too rapidly. January the 5th, they get a telegram from the admiral, Admiral Carden, saying it's possible. Already by February, they're going into action. Now, how do you take Constantinople without troops? The idea was you could do it with just ships. But how? Somebody has to occupy it. Well, the Russians will send troops. Well, they had not gotten this quite clear with the Tsar. Once he heard about it, he thought it was a good idea. He was going to take Constantinople, but the Greeks also wanted Constantinople. And Churchill said, well, they can send us 60,000 troops. Yes, but we don't want the Tsar in Constantinople. We want us, the Greeks, in Constantinople. So neither side ever sent troops. And in fact, the Greek government fell and a pro-German government took over before any of this could really get started. And then the admiral on the spot wasn't the man to do this. Churchill should have understood this. He was an old man. He had never had real military experience in battles on sea. He had been in charge of the fleet at Malta, the dockyards at Malta. And he didn't follow up his opportunity. He fired in February, and the forts were stilled, but nothing was then done until March. And he resigned. New admiral had to be put in his place, John de Robeck. But right there, you see changing in midstream. That's worrisome. And Churchill should have gotten worried. Instead, the fleet goes up on February the 18th. It's knocked out all the forts, and then one of the ships, a French ship, the Buvette, is sunk by a mine. And then three more, the Irresistible, the Inflexible, the Ocean, they're sunk. And suddenly the Navy is in a panic. And so they say, we need troops. Well, by this time, you ought to be re-examining the situation. But no, goaded by Churchill, the cabinet goes ahead and says, let's send an army man out. And the choice could not be more suited to Churchill. It is his old friend, Sir Ian Hamilton. Well, I even wrote a book about Sir Ian Hamilton's glorious march in South Africa. Sir Ian Hamilton had recommended Churchill for the Victoria Cross, Britain's highest medal for valor for Churchill's actions in the war in South Africa. But Ian Hamilton goes out without even really landing on the beaches, with an out-of-date map of Gallipoli, with an out-of-date handbook on the Turkish army. He stays on the island of Limnos, sails around a little bit, and says, well, you have to have troops to do this. Well, what is an army man going to say except, you have to have troops to do this? And we need lots of troops. And it is at this very moment that Lord Kitchener refuses to send troops that he has promised. They are needed on the Western Front, he insists. And so weeks drag on. And then when the troops are landed, the Turks are well entrenched, well led by the Germans. And you see, it is a setup for failure. But Churchill's impetuosity, his lack of antennae, lead him to rush on into this until it has become a disaster. And then he does not understand how weak his position is. He does not understand the swirl of hostility around him. The press is baying at him. Where are they getting so much of their information about Churchill's folly? From his fellow ministers who are leaking this information. And the fiasco is so terrible, and it is a terrible fiasco. By the time the British finally withdraw, there are 213,000 casualties for no gain whatsoever. It is the single most humiliating defeat in the entire First World War for the British. And a fall guy has to be found. You can't say the whole cabinet wanted this. Then the whole cabinet should step down. There has to be one person to fix the blame upon. And it is Churchill. The liberal government that has been conducting the war up until this time under Herbert Asquith can only stay in power if the Conservative Party is willing to form a coalition with them. And the Conservatives have their long memories, and they demand that Churchill be removed. And it is done in the most brutal fashion. He is simply gone from the Admiralty. And then, to add to the humiliation, he is given the most insignificant post in the cabinet, the Duchy of Lancaster, who has no responsibilities except to appoint justices of the peace. So politics is not only about ruining someone, it is about humiliating them as well. Now, Churchill's qualities played a large role in this happening to him. The very thing that made him a great statesman, his moral compass, set him up with his lack of antennae for this terrible fall. His refusal to stay in a box, his inability to make real friends. Churchill had people who were devoted to him, who admired him enormously. He had a lot of people in high position who hated him, but he had few real friends who would stick with him to the end. In fact, the man who played the greatest role in overthrowing him was David Lloyd George. He and Churchill had been, Churchill thought, close friends, and certainly colleagues in forcing through much of the welfare legislation of 1908, 1909, 1910. They were very different. Lord George came from a Welsh mining family. He had been raised by a widowed mother. He was a totally self-made man. But he and Churchill, they thought, were friends. Well, as Mrs. Churchill tried to convince her husband at the time, the Dardanelles, David is the one who turned you in. David is the one who ruined you. David is your Judas. Churchill could never believe it. He went to Lord George and said, you have got to intercede. You really control how this new government is going to be set up, regardless of what Herbert wants to do. You control it. And David said, you will have to go. And Churchill said, you don't care if I am ruined. You don't care if my enemies trample me underfoot. And then wrapping himself in patriotism, Lord George said, I don't care for myself either at this moment. All I want to do is win the war. And then there was this lunatic, Admiral Fisher. John Fisher, remember? Churchill's source of advice on redoing the Navy. Churchill had brought him back into the Admiralty. He had been the one to push Churchill to go for the Dardanelles. And then at the critical moment, he resigned, saying that Churchill, he is the one, was more dangerous than the Germans. And when Churchill said, please stay on at the Admiralty, he wrote a note off to all of Churchill's political enemies saying, he has offered me 30 pieces of silver, this Judas, but I will not betray my country. Now that's being a bad picker to think someone like Fisher is in your corner. Again, Mrs. Churchill tried to say, tell Winston, this man is a lunatic. I had him to lunch the way you requested, just Jack Fisher and me. We had lunch. It seemed all very pleasant. You were off in Paris. And Churchill was, in fact, off in Paris. He was negotiating to bring Italy into the war at that very moment on the British side. You were off in Paris, and he left. I thought he was gone. I started down the hall, and he jumped out at me and said, you foolish woman, you think Winston is off in Paris, but in fact he is with his mistress at this very moment. Now, he's deranged. Watch out for him. But Winston sails on, thinking everyone is as true as he is. And then the debate over the Dardanelles in the late spring and summer of that year, 1915. Why is the First Lord of the Admiralty, why was he always away from his office? Never there. Well, in fact, he had been away since the start of the war, from August 1914 until May 1915, 14 days. 7 of them in Antwerp, and the rest in Paris, negotiating to bring Italy into the war. It was a critical move to bring the Italians into the war. But I don't know why he's away so much. I don't think he's been away that much, has he? Well, I don't know, says the Prime Minister. But worst of all, Churchill goes to the Prime Minister and says, I would like, if you would want to see the speech I'm going to make, having laid down my office as First Lord of the Admiralty. I'm going to make my speech to Parliament, which was standard. And the Prime Minister, of course, his agreement was necessary, but it was always given, just a formality, said, I'm sorry, old boy, I don't think that would be appropriate at the moment. But I must be able to defend myself. No, I'm afraid things are a bit too delicate at the moment, perhaps later. So he is denied the right to speak out for himself at that critical moment when it is all still fresh. That's politics. That's politics. What does he do then? Well, we know what a politician would do today. He would step back, sign a huge contract, and write a tell-all book. What's really going on with the war? Learn the truth. Isn't that right? $5–6 million contract, huge royalties. Well, why not have these people been loyal to you? And the war is a mess. Lord George himself said, the War Department keeps 3 sets of figures. One to fool the public, one to fool the cabinet, one to fool themselves. Now, it's a horrible mess. And the cabinet knows if the public really understood the mindless slaughter that was going on. When you can still today go to a British village with 7 houses there and see on the First World War monument the names of 21 boys killed. When at the Somme in 1916, 20,000 British troops are killed in one day. And the slaughter went on. In 1917 in Passchendaele, General Haig sent the same kind of brave boy into the machine guns with staggering losses. One of his lieutenant generals went out, finely attired in whipcord breeches, high boots, swagger stick, got out of his car, and suddenly began to weep. He had no idea in his chateau, eating croissants, that the men were slogging through mud up to their knees trying to reach these machine guns. He wept and said, God forgive us for having sent men to fight in this. So Churchill could have told all, but he didn't. No. Instead, after staying briefly in this post as for the Duchy of Lancaster, he said, I want a command. Will you give me one? Will you give me a command in the field? And so he was sent out to do training. He thought he might get to be a general. No, they weren't going to let him be a general. But they said, if you show yourself to train well, we'll give it some more thought. And so he was sent to the Grenadier Guards for 2 months of training starting in November. And when he got there, he was told, you understand we were not consulted about your coming out here. And he met with stone silence from the officers. You can stay in that dugout, they told him, 1 foot deep in water. And yet, he won them over. He was always out for extra practice on the machine gun range, rifle range, took every dirty assignment, and then they gave him his command. Lieutenant Colonel, 6 Royal Scots Fusiliers. And he went up to the front, and he served beside his men in savage fighting. Quiet sector of the front, on a quiet day, 1,000 British soldiers died just from shelling. And Churchill was there. He kept his dugout as close to the front as possible. He went out on night patrols where they would bring back German prisoners. How proud I am of these men, he said, my soldiers. Fierce with their clubs and helmets. He always wore a French-style helmet. It gave him a little better protection. One night they were out patrolling, and he suddenly shouted out, God damn you! Who's got that light going? They said, sir, it's you. You've snapped your flashlight on by mistake. Oh, I'm sorry, he said. And at the end, soldiers told him, there is no better loved commander on this entire front than you. He won them over. brave, resolute, true. And so he served all through the spring of 1916. Once again, as he had done on the northwest frontier, at Omdurman, South Africa, showing that resolute bravery and character.